Welcome to Natural Resources University. This week's episode features Fire University, hosted by Marcus Lashley.
Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University podcast network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences, in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Welcome back, everybody, to Fire University. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that we have not covered, at least not in much detail, and that is ecosystem services of fire and what restoring a pine savanna can do in terms of restoring the plant communities and the processes in that system, how that affects ecosystem services. So I have Dr. Kevin Robertson from Tall Timbers Research Station. And Kevin, really good to see you. Always enjoy our conversations. You always make me really think about things from a different perspective, and I really appreciate that. So thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, I've talked to you about some of this work that you've been engaged in for the last few years. I've heard you mention it here and there and talk about, the ecosystem services that we get from restored pine savanna. So could you talk a little bit about, first of all, what is an ecosystem service, and then, what kind of spawned you, I guess, to work on this topic?
Ecosystem services in a general sense, if you're talking about a natural ecosystem, are the services that are provided to humans and human interest, very broadly speaking. So almost anything that falls in that broad category could be an ecosystem service, whether it's soil carbon sequestration, in mitigating climate change, or even aesthetics, just enjoying the outdoors. Hunting is an ecosystem service because it's a benefit to humans, affecting hydrological cycles, so on and so forth. One of the interests, there's a lot of interest in funding ecosystem services these days, so that provides some opportunities to do research on, getting a better idea of what these ecosystems are doing for human populations. As these systems become more and more challenged by climate change and development and just other human alterations, there's becoming an increasing concern about how is this really going to cost us in the long run in terms of human populations. And so it's something we need to get a better grip on, as a lot of these ecosystems are degraded, and to get a better idea of how to restore them and maintain them, not just for the own ecosystem service benefit, but for our long-term sustainability on this planet. So that's the very kind of broad interest in this topic.
Yeah, that's interesting. So along those lines, I know that you do a lot of work in pine savannas, southern pine savannas, particularly longleaf, and I think you have some shortleaf work as well.
That's right.
And I know you do other work as well, but in those systems, and I'm asking you kind of, I guess, to paint with a broad brush here, why are those systems degraded? Like, what has happened to them in general just over time?
Well, the longleaf pine ecosystem, broadly speaking, was estimated to cover over 90 million acres at one time, and now it probably covers less than 3 million. Just mostly alteration of land uses. So what used to be open, frequently burned pine savannas has been mostly converted today to either row crop agriculture or development, or the use of intensive pine plantations, or just kind of closed canopy forests where there's pretty much nothing but the pine trees themselves, and the silviculturalists try to keep it that way, to minimize competition and that sort of thing. So naturally, these are fairly low biodiversity ecosystems. Also, a big one is improved pasture in the Southeast. And then, of course, just completely unmanaged forests. So these pine savannas that covered most of the southeastern United States were maintained by frequent fire. And if you just take fire out of the ecosystem, then it drastically changes to a closed canopy, mostly hardwood forest with very
Mm-hmm.
little light on the ground and very few of the herbaceous species that make up most of the biodiversity. So those are really the big changes. Fire exclusion, row crop agriculture, pine plantations, improved pasture for grazing, and development.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that sounds like a lot of the general culprits that have impacted a lot of our systems that have
Sure.
played out really well, and or is a good example of that playing out in these
Hmm.
pine savannas. So, uh, this work that you've just recently done, when you're looking at restoration of pine savannas and how that affects these ecosystem services.
Hmm.
What what kind of systems were those? Like, where were you starting from? Was there a particular type of land use that you focused on?
Yeah, this project focused on the recovery from row crop agriculture specifically. And when I
Okay.
say row crop agriculture, that includes just disking annually for fallow fields. So basically starting with a disked field and then seeing what you can get out of that. And part of our interest in this is that in a lot of areas in the southeast United States where people have decided to manage for restoration of pine savannas, often for northern bobwhite quail habitat for hunting or for just biodiversity in general on public land, there's a history of intensive agriculture because it's widespread throughout the southeast. In some of these areas, it was on poor soil where the agriculture was never particularly productive. And so over time, those areas were abandoned, especially in the early 20th century. So we have a lot of this old field land, used to be agricultural land that isn't used for that anymore. And in some of those areas, like in the Red Hills region of northern Florida and southern Georgia, they've been frequently burned pretty much as soon as they could carry fire and then allowed to just become what they'll become. And what they become in this part of the world is an old field pine savanna, which is dominated usually by loblolly pine and shortleaf pine instead of longleaf pine. And often, has a lot of the same species that are native to the area, but then there's certain ones that don't come back. Chief among them, wiregrass in the eastern part of the coastal plain that's
Mm-hmm.
sort of associated with longleaf pine. So they're similar in structure, but different in composition. And so since there's a lot of this old field pine savanna around, we became interested in, well, how does it come about? Not just what is it now, but what's the process in which you get these old field pine savannas, and what are their ecosystem services relative to the initial state, which is row crop agriculture, but also how do they compare to native pine savannas, which is kind of the target goal, I guess, of
Mm-hmm.
restoration, which I don't think they can ever quite arrive at, but how close do they come, was a question that we had. And then also, how do the ecosystem services of these restored pine savannas compare to other common land uses like the one I just listed?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, what kinds of things, I guess so. Well, let's back up for a minute. So when you basically taken an approach where you're looking at areas that are in different stages of that process in terms of time, right? So
That's
there've
right.
been different times since the agriculture ceased and the community started to transition back into this old field.
Yeah, we use what they call a chronosequence approach or a
Mm-hmm.
space for time substitution, where specifically we went out and looked for areas that are currently in these old field, frequently burned conditions, but that had been abandoned at different times before the present. And
Mm-hmm.
so we did this by looking at historic aerial photographs and any kind of old records that we had. And so we identified areas that were currently row crop agriculture. So we assumed that to be the initial state, and
Mm-hmm.
then areas that where the tilling had ceased 5 to 15 years prior to the present, and then 15 to 30 years, and then 30 to 50 years, 50 to 75 years, and finally 75 to 100 years.
Oh
So he
wow.
categorizes different locations into those different times. And so there's, an assumption there that those different times since tilling would predict what would happen, going forward if you ceased tilling. And so that's why they call it a space for time substitution. It's not really
Hmm.
following it over time, but it's making certain assumptions about how things change over time
Yeah.
based on where they are today.
That's really interesting. So you had some reference or some sites that you were measuring that were almost 100 years or even 100 years since the agricultural cease. That's crazy
Right,
long.
right. Yeah, and they've
Yeah.
been and in all of these sites, I think this is important. They've been frequently burned at least at 2 year
Yeah.
intervals that whole time.
Oh, okay.
And we did another research project actually looking at dendrochronology evidence and also historical evidence that in this region those areas have in fact been frequently burned that whole time.
Hmm. Did you have any sites, maybe that were reference sites or something that that maybe they're 50 or 60 years post agriculture, but they just were not managed in terms of fire? Do you also have sites like that?
We did. That was one of the what we call common land uses that we were comparing the results to. So one
Hmm.
was just unmanaged forest where it may or may in most cases they were also old fields at one time in the past, 50 to 60, 70 years ago, but they had just been unburned, and so they turned into the typical kind of mixed pine, hardwood, closed canopy forest.
Hmm.
And then the other common land uses that we put plots into were well, row crop agriculture, of course, is the initial state, but then also improved pasture, usually bahia grass or centipede grass for forage,
Hmm.
and then also closed canopy pine plantations. And finally, the reference conditions, areas that had never been tilled before, which we were basing that on the current vegetation, including wiregrass and the suite of species that we know are really
Hmm.
soil disturbance sensitive, and then dominated by either longleaf pine or shortleaf pine.
Yeah. Okay. So what kinds of things were you measuring? Just to give us an idea, like what were you measuring for the ecosystem services as your response?
Well, we took a real kind of kitchen sink approach. We measured a very wide variety of things. Pretty much anything that we could measure, we measured to get a broad idea. So we put in 10 by 10 meter plots to measure all of the plant species in them. So plant species richness and abundance was one of them. And then sometimes we broke that down into categories like perennial grass cover. Perennial
Mm,
grass is important because that's the dominant biomass of a native longleaf pine savanna, and it has certain services like soil stability. Because when you burn, you just kind of take the top off of them and they resprout again, so the root
hmm.
system stays intact, and they're real important. And the root turnover contributes to soil carbon accumulation. And then like legume cover, because they're nitrogen fixers, so they're important for the soil chemistry. We measure the trees, the basal area, measured all their diameters. We measured canopy closure. We measured dead biomass to get an idea of the fuel loading. So
Hmm.
one ecosystem service is fire resilience. So the less fine fuels you have, the less subject they are to fire. We actually measured bees. We had collaborations with Mike Ullishin at the Southern Research Station, who's a bee expert, and we collected the bees and had them identify them because they're pollinators, and that's another
Hmm.
important ecosystem service is providing habitat for pollinators that we need for crops and just for natural ecosystem function. We also sampled the soil, so we looked at the soil chemistry, including total carbon, carbon nitrogen ratios, which are kind of a general measure of soil quality. And we collaborated with another scientist who's a mycologist who looks at the microbial, fungal, and bacterial content. That's Benjamin Sykes at the University of Kansas. So we were able to actually look at the fungal and the bacterial content um, over time, or what we're assuming to be
Hmm.
over time according to the chronosequence um, idea. And finally, we did some modeling using all these variables that we measured. We put into the WET model, or the water and erosion prediction model that's produced by USDA, to make estimates about runoff and sediment yield,
Hmm.
transpiration, deep percolation. All these things are important ecosystem services because more sediment yield means more pollution to water bodies. And so we wanted to see if the changes in vegetation were stabilizing the soil and reducing that. And also deep percolation is an important source of water for aquifer recharge.
Mm-hmm.
And conversely, if there's a lot of transpiration, you're losing a lot of water to the atmosphere that could be recaptured into lakes and streams. So all those things were of interest.
Yeah, it sounds like you're at least attempting to get as complete of a picture as you can on, like the whole ecosystem and how it's functioning, which is really cool.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And like I alluded to, a lot of these variables kind of feed into one another. So,
Mm-hmm.
another variable that was kind of a compilation of some of these measurements was total ecosystem carbon and how that changes over time, for example. So that included the soil, the trees, the dead
Yeah.
biomass, the logs on the ground, the whole thing. So yeah, it allowed us to come up with a lot of different variables that were of interest and to have input to these models as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what could you kind of summarize some of the findings? Like, what were there things that stuck out as really important for this restoration process, or just in general, what did you find?
Yeah, in a very general sense, most of the ecosystem services that are provided by native longleaf pine, wiregrass, or shortleaf bluestem communities were eventually provided by these old field pine savannas. So I'd say in general that the results were very encouraging. It's
Mm-hmm.
almost easier to talk about the exceptions than the ways in which it did seem to simulate native pine savanna ecosystem services. But one of them was plant species richness that increased very rapidly with mostly like 85-90% native on-site species. Like I said, it never quite arrives at longleaf pine communities because certain species like wiregrass and other kind of plants in the blueberry family, and there's this list that just tend to never come back into old fields for whatever reason. But certainly a high enough diversity to provide a very high pollinator population.
Mm-hmm.
The bees were very healthy and restored in those areas, and also to provide an adequate fuel load to frequently burn the habitat. Now, one thing that didn't come back is it did come back relative to native to row crop agriculture, but only about half as much as the native communities is perennial grass cover. So these old field communities, as we call them, or these restored pine savanna habitats, tend to be a little bit more forby and woody, and
Mm-hmm.
not as grassy. So they have to be burned under drier conditions. So that's kind of one limitation, but they are burnable, and it's that fire that's really critical. Um, the ecosystem carbon overall increased considerably. The soil carbon increased. The carbon nitrogen ratios steadily increased over time, which, like I said, is generally kind of considered a measure of soil health. One kind of cool thing that we weren't sure that was going to happen was there's a shift towards the native fungal and bacterial communities over time. In fact, after about 30 to 50 years, the fungal and bacterial community composition was almost indistinguishable from the native longleaf pine wiregrass communities. And whereas they're extremely different in the initial state of the row crop agriculture,
Yeah,
and
that
that's
is really
super
interesting.
encouraging. Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's those microbes that are really kind of the engines running the whole ecosystem in a sense. They're
Mm-hmm.
responsible for those decomposition processes and for regulating the soil chemistry. And also there's a shift from plant pathogens, soil fungi to symbiotic fungi. So your mycorrhizal fungi.
Mm-hmm.
And those, as we're increasingly understanding, is kind of the glue that holds the ecosystem together. It
Yeah.
helps plants absorb nutrients and really improves ecosystem health. This is consistent with some theory that's been developed recently that early on in succession, there's a higher percentage of pathogens, which kind of help to do in the early successional plants
Mm.
and make a way for the later successional plants to come in. And those later successional plants tend to be longer lived, more stable plants like your perennial grasses
Mm-hmm.
and your longleaf pines. And those allow for those ectomycorrhizal and endomycorrhizal fungi to develop those networks that really help those plants persist and absorb the nutrients that they need. So this was consistent with some theory that had been presented about how that shift in fungi from more pathogenic fungi to symbiotic goes on through succession and helps stabilize the system.
Yeah. Well, something that is interesting, and I don't know if you have data on it, or maybe you can just give your perspective on it. If not, so you said there's suite of plant species, and I know you mentioned wiregrass, but it sounded like there was a suite of species that they basically never came back.
Yeah, that's right. And this is pretty well documented by several different studies in the Southeast. They tend to be the same species in the different studies. So it seems to be a pretty widespread phenomenon.
Well, and then you were talking about the fungi transition going back to symbiotic species. Do you think that's is that one of the main things that is limiting those species? Like, would you eventually see them recolonize? Maybe it's 500 years down the road once the community gets suitable and they have their symbionts that they need.
It's really hard to know what's restricting these plants from coming back in, and it could be a case by case basis. So in the case of wiregrass, we know that it's just a really poor disperser. Its seed viability tends to be very low. It only produces seed and viable seed if it's burned at a certain time of the year, which is like from late April till July. In a lot of the burning that goes on in these areas, especially if they're old fields, tends to be earlier, February or March, where it's dry enough to get them to burn. So we know that one's pretty much just dispersal limited. Maybe there's a disperser that's not in the systems. I think Kevin Hires hypothesized that bison with their woolly fur may have picked up those Aristida seeds and then wallowed in the dirt and moved them, or so. There could be some kind of ecosystem engineer there that's missing from the system. Who knows? Other ones, it might be because of the change in the soil texture. Now, a lot of the soil chemistry, I didn't really talk about this yet, but it also recovered towards native pine savanna conditions. In particular, the most of the soil mineral nutrients decreased over time because the native system is very, very low in mineral nutrients. In nitrogen was about the same, but the soil texture is different in these old fields because with all that disking, there was a lot of erosion. There wasn't a lot of plants to hold everything together, and so that sandy cap that's on the surface of native communities has largely disappeared. And so I think some of the plants that don't come back, for example, pineland twinflower, Discus oblongifolia, really like sandy soil. And so with that sand missing, that might be the factor there. Wiregrass like sandy soil too, so that could be an additional limiting factor. A bunch of the blueberry family, we're kind of curious about that. It might be an animal dispersal limitation. There might be something about these disturbed habitats where there's not as much dispersal of consumable fruits, but we really don't understand that one. You would think that that blueberries and huckleberries would be readily dispersed to a new location, but they seem to be very limited in these systems for reasons that we don't really understand. So it's a big question that we don't have a good answer to.
Yeah, well, that's why I wanted you to kind of talk about it, because I think it is an interesting discussion to be having and thinking about and trying to figure out ways to understand it better. One thing that was really striking to me was in one of these reference sites, like you were describing that you measured in the study, and maybe even been one of the reference sites that you used that I was on when I saw it for myself. But there was in this reference site, and when I'm saying reference site, I mean it's never been in agriculture, still an intact ground community with all these species that never come back. They were all present there. But because the people that were managing it at some point in time needed to put in a fire line, so they had a disc line, basically, where those plants were no longer present. And I forget, it was one of the tall timber scientists mentioned it, and it just really brought it to my attention. Even some of those abandoned fire breaks that, maybe 50 or 60 or 70 years old, even, they're surrounded by an intact community, but they still didn't
that's right.
recolonize the disc line, even though it hasn't been disked in decades. And that was when it really struck me, like, there's something really interesting going on here that is limiting these. Some of the plants are literally hanging over it. Like, they don't have to disperse anywhere. The seeds can just fall into the thing, or they could vegetatively move into it, but they don't.
Yeah, in that case, you almost have to believe it's something to do with the soil.
Right.
The soil is much more compact in those areas because once you
Mm-hmm.
destroy that natural soil texture that has the roots and the insects and the pocket gophers and everything, keeping it fluffy and
Mm-hmm.
soft, and it gets kind of packed down into a hard pan, that could be resisting some of them. There's the erosion issue that I talked about. Those fire
Mm-hmm.
breaks tend to carry that fine sand away, and you get left with the heavier clays that again pack more solid. The nutrients are different. We've measured that ourselves, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, what exactly is the equation that's preventing specific plants? It still does kind of remain sort of a mystery.
Yeah, and like you said, it probably depends on the plant species and what the actual mechanism is. But it is really interesting to me when I saw that. Like the plants they need to get literally 1 meter, and they can't
Yeah,
seem to do that.
I suspect that once certain factors are taken out, they're hard to return. So,
Mm-hmm.
pocket gophers, for example, are really important for stirring up the soil in these native systems. But they only exist where they have that natural sandy cap on the surface. And once that's lost, the pocket gophers disappear.
Mm-hmm.
And then once that happens, you don't have this important mechanism for continuing to do the bioturbation they call it, or the fluffing up of the soil
Mm-hmm.
through their burrowing. So that's just an example of how once you lose something, it's kind of hard to get it back.
Yeah. Well, one thing, just you're bringing back these memories when I visited one of these reference sites, and it's one of the few that I have actually visited in my whole career, and I was prepared to kind of take it in this last time. Some of the things that I was observing that were sticking out to me, and one of them was the soil texture. Like you could literally, it feels spongy when you walk around on
Yeah,
it
that's
compared
right.
to what you're used to in most scenarios, which is a large portion of the landscape has been in some sort of
Yeah,
alternative practice. So,
especially if heavy equipment's been kept out, because the soils
right.
are these ultisols, they call them, are heavily compactable by skidders and other
Mm-hmm.
vehicles in the woods.
Yeah, and I mean, you literally could feel it when you walk, as soon as you
Yeah,
step into it, it
feels like a
feels like
bouncy castle.
yeah, it's like really spongy.
Yeah.
And another thing that along those same lines that really resonated with me is uh, what we were able to put rebar. We were putting
Hmm.
up a net to try to catch birds, and literally rebar we could push down into the ground with our hand,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
People
and
gasp when they see that. They've never seen anything like it before. It's
yeah,
true.
that I mean, it's just amazing, and to think, that like just that alone, that is a huge change in the
Yeah.
system. But that's one of the things that you measured, right? Or at
That's
least
right,
some.
and it did slowly over time start to recover,
Mm-hmm.
not quite to those levels, but over time, starting with the row crop agriculture situation, the soil bulk density
Mm-hmm.
decreased over time, so the soils became more aerated, presumably because of just more soil biota coming back into the system and stirring that soil up again.
Mm-hmm.
You would think that an annually disked field would have low bulk density because you're disking it, but you're also homogenizing it, taking all the roots out of it and
Mm-hmm.
and creating an ecosystem that's not friendly to most of the insects and everything. So as soon as the disc plow leaves and you start having rains and everything, it really compacts that soil down pretty tightly. And that's one of
Mm-hmm.
the reasons that no-till agriculture is kind of coming on. They're realizing there's a lot of advantage to having just the natural soil organisms keep the soil aerated instead of disking it in a way that
Mm-hmm.
breaks up those mycorrhizal networks and reduces habitat for the insects and the animals that actually provide for the soil health.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those
Yeah.
results can be seen through the hydrological modeling as well. The deep percolation increased over time,
Mm-hmm.
eventually as the soil became more porous and less dense, and that's a good thing as well. It also, if you can absorb more water, it decreases overland flow, which decreases erosion and sedimentation, which also
Mm-hmm.
decreases your soil pollution from all those things. So, yeah, the soil bulk density is a real important factor, a real
Mm-hmm.
important ecosystem service.
So, um, I know you've kind of covered it, but what were the things? What not recovered necessarily fully, but what were the things that rebounded really fast, like the couple of metrics versus the things that maybe they didn't recover at all,
Yeah,
or very
well,
little?
one thing that recovered very quickly was this plant species richness.
Yeah.
So, it didn't recover to native conditions right away, but it jumped up about halfway within about a decade of burning. So
Okay.
that's a
Yeah,
real,
that's what I was going to ask.
a nice, yeah, as we say, a prescribed fire, just that frequent fire is the closest thing we have to a silver bullet in terms of ecosystem restoration.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, the plant species richness is important for your insect diversity and including your bee pollinators and in stabilizing the soil and in a suite of other services in themselves. The perennial grass cover recovered steadily, from when you stop burning, and so that's important for that soil stabilization as
Yeah.
well.
So that was sort of a gradual change that was pretty consistent. And then,
Yeah.
so what about the things that you went quite a long time before you really started to pick up steam, or maybe you never did over that time? Were there any metrics like that?
Well, a lot of them were kind of steadily changed over time. So most of the soil metrics, soil carbon accumulation, was
Mm-hmm.
pretty gradual and slow, as were the decreases in mineral nutrients like calcium and potassium and magnesium and phosphorus. Soil pH kind of gradually decreased over time. So those things take time, as you'd kind of expect. I mean, you don't generally think of soil characteristics as changing
Mm-hmm.
abruptly. But on the other hand, there's a long time where people thought that soil characteristics were almost changed on a geological time scale, like the physical characteristics of the soil really determined everything about it. So, maybe these changes took decades, but relative to the way people used to think about soil, it's interesting how land management can really change soil conditions a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we saw really, really big decreases in these soil nutrients that were unnaturally high, because of additions of lime and fertilizer during the agricultural phase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective as well. That with the soils, if you were thinking about them changing over geologic time, this study, even though they may have taken the entire 100-year period, that's
Hmm.
still really, really fast in comparison to, if we're thinking on the scale of tens of thousands or even, hundreds or even a million
Right.
years.
And really, most of those changes happen within about 30 to 50 years. So,
Mhm.
well within a lifetime for sure. You can see these
Yeah.
changes occurring. And the initial drops were precipitous. The first 15 years were the biggest changes.
Hmm.
So most of the biggest changes happened soon, and then they kind of slow down over time.
Yeah.
So again, prescribed fire was the main factor there.
Right.
Just burning, burning, burning. Because if you don't have that fire, the succession goes in a completely different direction. It goes towards
Yeah.
that
So,
woody, closed canopy hardwood, forest.
so kind of honing in on that, you also had the comparison where they no longer in agriculture, but they didn't have fire.
Hmm.
How did those compare to the savanna where there was more fire?
Well, one thing that was very clear is that the species richness was extremely low, and you can kind of
Hmm.
see that from walking into these sites where pretty much the only thing on the ground is leaf litter and a few kind of shade tolerant vines and woody things, so that's
Hmm.
that's a big thing by itself. The soil carbon, ecosystem carbon is very high because you've got these big trees all close together in there. Of course, it's not a particularly useful habitat for most things. I mean, maybe
Hmm.
maybe some deer hunting or turkey hunting or something like that, but it's not the type of ecosystem that's producing a product in terms of wood or providing habitat for the species that are most endangered in these habitats.
Hmm.
Their transpiration rates are high, and that's kind of undesirable. That's water going up back into the air that
Hmm.
could be going down into the soil to replenish our aquifers and to replenish lakes and rivers. So that's one kind of unnatural aspect of these fire excluded closed canopy systems is that they just take up a lot of water,
Hmm.
more so than what's happened in the past. Species like longleaf pine and wiregrass and the other perennial grasses that dominate in the native systems have really high water use efficiency, which just means that they produce a lot of biomass with a relatively small amount of water.
Hmm.
And so restoration of those, that's something that we didn't really model. We just kind of modeled based on the abundance of trees and grasses and the soil types and that kind of thing. But really, if you get into how the water use efficiency differs with the types of plants that become common with a frequently burned restoration project, the results would be even better, I think, because
Mm-hmm.
the increase of perennial grasses, the increase of pines over broadleaf species, all this means that you're getting more productivity from the system and using less water and allowing that water to go down into the soil and into our water bodies, into our aquifers where they're beneficial.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like without the fire, a lot of the positive benefits of letting go fallow and start that process, a lot of them are dampened, but
Yeah,
they
they definitely go in a
still,
different direction.
yeah, but they still might be better than the pasture or the row crop agriculture in several of these metrics.
It's kind of a trade-off, and that was another point of our study too, is kind of acknowledging trade-offs between different systems, because row crop agriculture produces an ecosystem service of food production, right?
Yeah.
So if
Mm-hmm.
you stop using it for that, then that's a decrease in that particular service.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that most of the other ecosystem services become less desirable, or less desirable with row crop agriculture because there's more erosion and there's less diversity and et cetera, et cetera. Uh, one thing about the closed canopy hardwood forest is that you also lose your bee pollinators.
Mm-hmm.
But they are very high actually in the row crop agriculture and the pasture areas. Now, it might have been an
Mm-hmm.
artifact of our trapping the bees because we were using pan traps out there. And the more open the habitat is, the easier the bees can travel around, and they also can see those traps better. So
Mm-hmm.
we did a rarefication process to try to correct for that. But even so, we can see that in the open areas you have a lot of bees, but in those closed pine plantations and unmanaged forest, they really fall out, which makes
Mm-hmm.
sense because you don't have very many herbaceous plants in there that have the flowers that attract the bees.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. So how long would you say on most of these sites? I know this is probably another one of those questions that's hard to answer without some context, but how long after the agricultural practice ceased did they start burning them? Or how long does it need to be before you can start burning them?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've done, we've kind of watched it in real time here at Tall Timbers because we have stopped tilling certain areas and started burning them. And I would say within about 5 years or something, you can get a burn in there. It depends a lot on whether or not you plant trees too. So
Mm-hmm.
typically today, you wouldn't do what was done 100 years ago, which is just kind of burning and doing nothing else and letting these loblolly pines and shortleaf pines volunteer into the area. Usually, what's done today is people will plant longleaf, oftentimes longleaf because it's tolerant of the fire and it produces a lot of fuel for the fire.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what really allows you to be able to burn these sites pretty quickly. Is if don't just have those grasses starting to seed in, like some of the early successional grasses, like broom sedge, is an important early fuel, but you also have that longleaf that longleaf needle cast falling on the ground. Then you can burn it within probably 2 to 5 years.
Mm-hmm. So if someone planted, a 40-acre block in longleaf seedlings,
Hmm.
are you saying that it'd be reasonable to get in there 2 years after that in some cases, and certainly by 5 years after it, and
It,
that would
it,
be
it wouldn't burn
desirable?
well at first, I mean, burning is a
Yeah.
relative term too, right? You can light it and it'll skunk around and everything, but generally what we've seen is that if you get it to burn once, then it'll burn again
Mm-hmm.
because the fire itself helps to stimulate germination of plants and helps stimulate the resprouting of the grasses. And it just seems like once you get a fire in there, it'll burn pretty well the next time. But the first few burns, in those first 5, 6, 7 years can be kind of patchy and everything. But
Mm-hmm.
certainly as those long leaves start to come up and you start getting, broom sedge, like I said, is often one of the first grasses that comes in pretty strong within the first decade.
Mm-hmm.
It's flammable enough, when under dry weather to get those fires in there. and then all kinds of other stuff starts to come in after that.
Yeah. So what about the pine seedlings? I guess they'd still be in a grass stage at that point,
Yeah.
at least with the first fire. Is that?
Yeah, that's another factor. Is longleaf pine's hard to predict when it'll bolt.
Mm-hmm.
They can stay in the grass stage for a long time, but usually if you reduce the competition, competition's generally pretty low when you plant in these fields, and they'll start growing vertically pretty much right away. The next year, next two
Yeah.
years is what I've seen, and then
Well,
within 5 or 6 years, they're head high or so, and they're producing a lot of needles.
yeah. Well, I would say you probably get the question all the time. I get it quite a bit. People have gotten enrolled in a program that has helped them go in and plant longleaf pine seedlings,
Mm-hmm.
and then they want to know, well, when can I start burning them? When should I start burning them?
Yeah.
It's hard to answer that question. So I just wanted to get your perspective on that, because I think we probably have a lot of listeners that are in that shape, that they either have or they're about to plant longleaf,
If you plant
they
them
don't
with
know what to do.
yeah, if they're containerized, generally the rule of thumb is you can burn them about a year after you plant them.
1 year.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that case, as long as you can carry the fire,
Mm-hmm.
you're not really worried about killing the
No,
pines.
actually, they're better shape in the grass stage, close to the ground, than they are when they're about head high.
Yeah.
It's when they're in that candle stage, they call it, or that vertical growth period, when they're, from like chest high to 15 feet high is when they're most vulnerable, because they're putting on a lot of height, but not a lot of bark yet. And also their
Mm-hmm.
meristems are higher above the ground, where they catch more heat during the fires. So
Yeah.
that's when they're in that stage that you want to, probably burn under fairly gentle conditions. Good enough to burn, but maybe like in the winter when the ambient temperature is a little cooler, tends to be
Mm-hmm.
easier on the pine. So I think the first few burns when you're restoring pines, it's probably a good idea to do them in January, February, and
Yeah.
definitely not in the growing season, until they've got some secondary growth or got some more bark on them where they can resist those kinds of fires.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. I know that's definitely one of the top questions that I get from people. And of course, when they're contacting me, they're usually wondering about, they were trying to get it burning because they want to improve wildlife habitat and maintain that. And they're less focused on, the forest products, or, the
Mm-hmm.
even necessarily the other ecosystem services, which I guess the wildlife habitat is one of the services that the fire is providing. But I certainly get that
Sure.
question enough that I wanted to ask you about it and see what your thoughts were on it.
Yeah, those young longleaf can take the fire, especially, if they're containerized. They already have a root system, and it quickly
Mm-hmm.
grows into the soil, and they're good to go about a year after, and they benefit from the reduction of competition from the fire. So
Mm-hmm.
they really do well with the fire.
Yeah.
It helps
That's,
to prune them too, and helps them when they start to grow vertically. That the fire will help them grow straight and tall
mm-hmm.
instead of bushing out too much, and that's another important benefit of the fire to longleaf.
Yeah. Well, another question that, I know you've been doing research on this stuff for a long time, and maybe you're better at predicting outcomes now than I certainly am in my studies than I was earlier in my career. But I was curious with this study that we've been talking about, which we'll provide a link to for people if they want to look at it in our show notes. Uh, what was like the most surprising thing to you, whether it was positive or negative? Was there something that really stuck out? They were just like, wow, I did not expect that at all.
Well, like I mentioned, the fungal in bacterial results were a little surprising to me, because in a positive way,
Yeah.
that they recovered so well just by bringing that fire back and getting those native plants starting to become established in those areas again. Because after decades of disking, I would have thought that almost any remnant of the native fungal community would be just eradicated.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing that is interesting in looking at and we haven't published this paper yet, we're looking kind of deeper at what particular species, or OTUs, they call them, operational taxonomic units, when they haven't given them a species yet for these little microscopic fungi and bacteria. But that there really aren't that many that are special to the native habitat. So what really happens is when you disc an area, often in row crop agriculture, you just get lots and lots of different species of fungi and bacteria that you usually wouldn't have. They're kind of, more off-site or exotic, or I don't know, maybe they're associated with a lot of the agricultural weeds that come into there. I'm not sure what it is, but the process of having the fungal and the bacterial communities become more natural is really one of sort of paring them down to a subset of that larger group. There are a
Oh, that's
few that are
interesting.
kind of like pyrogenic or special to native habitats, but most of them aren't really that specialized. It's just that there's a lot fewer of them in the
Mm-hmm.
native habitat.
Well, that's
Um,
kind of so with
that's
the
surprising to me.
yeah, no, that's surprising to me, which is stimulating another follow-up question. So when you go in and disc an area and for plant and agriculture or whatever, you're saying not necessarily some specialists, but some things that aren't usually present move in
hmm
to that context as opposed to I kind of expected it to be less diverse and there to be some real generalist, I guess, in the disking scenario, and then you would get specialist recolonizing, which it sounds
Yeah,
like you kind of maybe have been thinking about it similar to that, and it
right.
sounds
And
like to me it's sort of the opposite of that.
when I say there's like a higher diversity of the fungi, that's kind of based on a presence absence. It doesn't mean that there's a lot of them. It just means
Yeah, yeah.
that, I mean, that they're very abundant. So I think what happens in this successional process after you've abandoned the farmland and you're doing the burning and it's becoming more natural is that the fungi that are naturally more dominant become more dominant again.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those ones that were introduced because of the agriculture, they tend to kind of fade into the background. That seems to be
Yeah,
what's going on. So that's what
yeah, that's really
happens with
interesting.
the mycorrhizal fungi that we're talking about, these symbiotic fungi that are really important. They're able to build their networks back up again to
Mm-hmm.
link plants to the resources in the soil and help them grow better. So that seems to be what's going on. Now, fire does knock back the fungi a little bit, as has been shown with some recent studies. And that's part of the reason we think that soil carbon accumulates in the soil when you frequently burn, is because the fungal communities that are in that litter that gets consumed by the fire, it kind of sets things back a little bit. And so the decomposition process is a little bit slower when you're frequently burning. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
wipe out the fungal community. They kind of hide out in the soil, but then
Mm-hmm.
they have to kind of grow back up into that litter again as it falls on the ground. And it makes the whole decomposition process slower, but that's, it's a natural part of the ecosystem
Right,
that
right.
results in there being a lot of soil carbon.
Yeah, that is really, really cool. Well, in in terms of this work or just your work in general, are there any take-home messages that you think are important for people to think about on this topic area?
Yeah, I think the take-home message is fire, fire, fire. Like I
I don't
said,
think
that
anybody in the audience is. I think they're all carrying the torch already.
well, good, good, yeah,
Yeah,
but
that's going to resonate with them.
it really is remarkable though that with basically doing almost nothing other than applying frequent fire, you could add in there maybe managing timber. If there's too much timber in there, you might need to
Hmm.
cut some of it out to get that light on the ground. More and more we're having problems with exotic species, so
Yeah.
making sure that they don't take over when you've abandoned a farmland. But apart from that, it's really remarkable what that frequent fire does in terms of providing the habitat for more and more native species to return, the native bees, the native animals, the microbial community in the soil, the whole shebang pretty much comes back from that one management practice. And so that's a kind of a different perspective, like you're alluding to before, from the traditional sense of succession, where you just let it go and do nothing, in
Hmm.
which case it would turn into this unnatural system of a closed canopy, pine hardwood forest, where you lose a lot of those ecosystem services. But since our modern landscape's highly fragmented and we don't have natural fires sweeping across the landscape like there might have been in the past, we do have to recreate that situation with prescribed
Hmm.
fire. But it's good news that just one management practice can have so many benefits, provide so many ecosystem services.
Yeah.
We're pushing that, pretty hard with like the NRCS, for example, for trying to advise them on their cost share programs and saying,
Hmm.
you can have this special program for this and this and this ecosystem services, but really, if you funnel more of that into just getting people to do prescribed burning, Now, there's a lot of things that come along with that. There's the knowledge and the equipment and the
Mm-hmm.
and liability issues and everything, and that's a whole different topic. But if you can get that fire in there, and frequent fire too, it's not just burning it once or burning it, twice a decade. It's that biennial fire, burning at a 2-year fire return interval, I think is really important for these old
Mm-hmm.
field habitats, especially. The fire has to be even a little bit more frequent than the native systems.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. Great take home. I think it'll resonate with people. Fire, fire, fire. Yeah, it's good stuff. Well, I don't want to keep you all day. I know you're busy doing a lot of this really cool research and stuff. So I appreciate you taking some time to talk to us about it and highlight some of this recent work that you've published. And yeah, I really appreciate that.
It was
Any
great to be
other?
with you today. I sure appreciate the opportunity, and
Yeah. Well,
anytime.
I guess we can wrap it up there. Thanks again for coming on. Thanks everybody out there for listening. We'll provide your contact information. I know we've had you on the show before, but we'll provide contact information if anybody is interested in following up with you, and also provide a link to the paper we were discussing. So it's good stuff. Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.